The katana and rapier are opposing forces, fire and water, cat and dog, the internet and rational discourse. Okay, not that incompatible. But who would win? I've already said my piece about these hypothetical who would win duels and which weapon is better, and as you know, it depends primarily on the user's skill. But of course, fighting style and weapon still matters. And in this case, it really kind of is like fire and water. Right now, the only katana I have is in Shirasaya mount, which means basically it's unfinished. It's really intended just for storage, although in this case, it's also essentially a sword cane, kind of hidden. But either way, for demonstration, it'll do. All right, setting up the katana in forward-facing guard, which is what you'd want against a sword like this. We'll get back to that in a moment. I want to control the opponent's blade past the center line so I can push it aside and make sure it can't threaten me. Now, if I try to obtain a favorable bind and the opponent holds against it, turns the edge against it and just resists, so I can't actually get that, then I would disengage and push the other side. So I let the opponent go in the direction he wants to instead of allowing him to control my blade. So I slip under and now I'm pushing in the direction that he's already going. If the opponent gets a little too eager and overcommits when pushing on the blade, it gets even worse. That's assuming a good reaction time with the rapier, of course. By the way, there's a bit of irony here in that I'm demonstrating Italian techniques with a Spanish rapier. Spanish rapier fencing is very different in its mechanics and tactics, but I'm just not familiar enough with it. What would the fighter with a katana try to do? It's pretty limited what I can say about it because I'm not trained in traditional Japanese swordsmanship. But here are some speculative ideas. So for one, I'm thinking you probably don't really want to be in any guard other than this. Because if you're here, it's way too easy for the rapier to quickly thrust in while being at a distance where you can't even reach them.
月見えないかもね。
Yeah.
怖い怖い怖い。
Even with the blade forward, it can be difficult to react in time. Here's something to point out though. In sparring, we usually stop when a hit is landed. In real combat, a rapier thrust may be lethal, but not necessarily immediately incapacitating. Which is why it's so important to bind and control the opponent's blade for a covered thrust like I showed earlier. Due to the reach, I'll show you that in a moment, there's not too much you can do to threaten them directly here either, but the advantage here is this blade has a lot more mass than the rapier, especially this type of rapier. So what you would want to do is cover yourself and try to get a bind, basically similar to what the rapier fighter is trying to do. So as soon as you've got this, you can now move in and push it down and then move in for a cut. Speed is crucial here. You have to overbind and close in more quickly than the opponent can create space and clear the point. If you're already in a forward-facing guard and you just do this, just a very slight beat and then move in, you might be able to pull it off, but definitely not from a guard like this to come in with a big cut like that because it's just way too exposed. It's too easy for the rapier user to deny contact and then just threaten you as you expose yourself and move in like this. If you deliver a wide cut, this is completely open. So you would have to keep it pretty tight and make sure that you don't expose yourself. One good tactic I can see would be to bait a thrust. So maybe you lower your sword a little bit or kind of deliberately put it off center a little bit. Not too much to not telegraph your intention, but just let it dip a little bit and expect the thrust coming in here. And when it does, you can quickly catch it on the bottom half of your blade and then displace it and cut. Okay, so reach. The reach difference between these two is enormous. First off, you can see that the rapier has a significantly longer blade to begin with. And then to show you the actual reach difference, so this is the target. With the rapier, if I want to just about touch it, I'm over here. The katana with two hands is still pretty far away from that. If I use one hand, I can bring it forward a little bit, but it still can't reach. You have to actually be close enough that the thrust is effective, enough to reach internal organs. So it's probably more like this. which is still not enough for the katana to reach with two hands. And with one hand, you can just barely get there. There are techniques like the Passata Soto, which maximizes reach combined with evasive action, but it's very committed. If this fails, it's slow to recover from. Cutting with a rapier, well, this particular type here is pretty lousy at cutting, just because it has a really narrow blade. This blade, even though it's fairly narrow as well, hits noticeably harder. I know from sparring that you get a pretty substantial whack. Because it's so long and because it keeps tapering, you can't cut with just a tip. This is just not effective. So you have to be quite a bit further down. In fact, the sweet spot seems to be about here. So we're talking this kind of reach. At that distance, the katana can just about reach with two hands for a shallow tip cut, and with one hand is quite a good cut, really. These two are basically polar opposites. If you wanted to pretty much reverse a sword design, you would come up with something fairly close to this. Now, it would depend on the individual sword. There are wider rapiers, there are shorter blades, there are katanas with somewhat longer blades. You'll see heavier and lighter ones, etc., etc. But this is just about as extreme as it gets. One sword's advantage is the other sword's disadvantage. As said, the rapier has enormous reach and a highly effective thrust. The katana has limited reach, but a highly effective cut. This narrow-bladed rapier in particular is extremely light and gives you a lot of tip control. You can easily make a small circle to disengage and thrust to just about any opening very quickly. This is pretty much the opposite. It's all about the cut. It can thrust, of course, and reasonably well, but overall this is much more cut-centric and you can work better up close. If you're basically at almost grappling distance, there is still plenty you can do with this. You can slice up close, you can lever the opponent's blade, you can pretty easily use the other hand for support. Well, this is very awkward up close. If the opponent gets past the point and you're unable to disengage and bring it back into action, you have a problem. Like, yes, you can try to grab the blade and work with it this way. You can try to strike with the guard. This would be quite painful, but this is not where you want to be in general. So with the rapier, you want to keep your distance and threaten with the point and prevent the opponent from moving in. And with the katana, that's exactly what you want to do. You want to close the distance as quickly as possible to get past that point, which is so dangerous. So this would be a high-risk situation. An unarmored duel between a rapierist and a katana user would favor the rapier at the beginning, but it could quickly turn to a 180, and now the rapier user is at high risk. I used to think that a two-handed sword can generally break the block of a single-handed sword, but that's only if you do it incorrectly. Their complex hilt gives you the hand protection to comfortably parry low on the blade and resist even a powerful cut with two hands. I think this side sword here would be a better match. When it comes to blade length, it still has a little bit on the katana, slightly longer, and again, because you're fighting with one hand in a more bladed stance, you have more reach. This is a much more substantial blade. It can cut very well, for one, and it's also not as easy to manipulate because the lever isn't quite as long. That works against you, and there's just more mass here. And this makes for a very strong parry. There's no need for a big movement. You don't need to meet the opponent's blade with your own blade. That is a way to do it, but if you have to quickly respond, essentially this is all you need. Just close the line and it's going to hit here or here, and then it's going to be stopped by this large complex hilt. Your hand is essentially completely safe from cuts. Thrusts could still target it. So I'm thinking a duel between a side sword like this and a katana would probably go on for longer than between a narrow blade rapier and a katana, just because it's not as risky for both of them. There's a little bit more defense. And of course, you can have something in between like this that gives you enormous reach due to the very long blade, but the blade is wide enough to also be quite good at cutting, at the disadvantage that it's quite a bit heavier and not as nimble as the other option. Now, what if you swapped them? Let's say you had an unarmored duel between a musketeer and a samurai, and you made them swap weapons. This would be a disaster. It would be extremely awkward for both of them because their fighting style is just not suited to what this is. So if I had to fight with the katana, with a rapier style, so now I don't have the reach I need, but worse, the balance is all wrong. For a rapier to really be effective, you need most of the mass in the hilt so that the point is comparatively light. You can kind of do it here because the long handle does help counterbalance it a little bit, but it's so much more awkward and the curve is not really suitable for the kind of work that you normally do with a rapier. How would the samurai use a rapier? Well, a video was put up on the Let's Ask Seki Sensei channel just a while ago. I'm a little bit late to the party, but let's take a look at how it went briefly. Some people said they were disappointed by how little this resembles a rapier, which is true. It's really not all that similar, but what are they supposed to do? If they can't get an actual rapier, then this is the closest approximation. That is actually a rapier sidesword and broadsword technique as well. So the concept is as the opponent thrusts, you have superior leverage because you're binding high up on their blade and you can force the overbind like this. It works best when the bind happens high up on their blade, which is known as the weak, and lower on your blade, which is the strong, just for mechanical reasons. This entire circular movement is not common with a rapier as far as I know. Typically circular movements are used for disengaging, where you change from one side of the opponent's blade to the other and then strongly bind and thrust. Now I'm not familiar with every rapier or sidesword style and there are significant differences. Maybe there are sources that use this kind of circular movement.
本来は金属になるんですけど
That wouldn't be out of place at all. A beat followed by a countercut. That's more of a side sword thing than rapier, but there's some overlap. That you would see in rapier fencing just with a smaller circle. You know, he's doing a pretty large circle, which, you know, if the balance isn't as far back as with a rapier, that's what you end up doing because it's much easier to do small circles with this kind of backward weighted balance.
タイミングでつくとかね。
Yeah.
ついて
And that's, of course, where the blade length comes in handy, and particularly also the stance. With the rapier, you just have more reach, so you are able to evade the cut, and you're still within your own measure. You can still thrust to the arms or maybe even to the body without being exposed.
月見えないかもね。
Yeah.
怖い怖い怖い。
That's very true. Thrusts are hard to see coming. You can see the footwork, you can see when somebody's approaching, but when the point is aimed at your face and goes straight forward, it's pretty difficult to see exactly where it is, just because the depth perception is much more challenging.
見えないから、あんまりね大きい動作で打たないように。
Yes.
だからこっちも月
Absolutely.
と小切りしか使えない。
I think those are techniques that would work better with a side sword rather than a rapier. This, I think, would be extremely awkward in the hands of someone who is trained to use a katana but not a rapier. So I think both would be extremely out of their element. Of course, both have the fundamentals, you know, footwork, timing, distance management, but the distance management is all screwed because they're not used to this length. Who would have the better chance if they were to swap weapons? I think it would be quite likely that both injure each other and just don't have a whole lot of success. Each would know how to counter the weapon that the opponent uses because that's what they're familiar with, but they wouldn't have the tools to counter it effectively. In an unarmored duel between Musketeer and Samurai, who would win? Again, that depends a lot on the individual skill. If we assume peak human fitness and both equally experienced, equal in whatever kind of skill rating you would come up with, it might be a 50-50 chance, or it might be slightly in favor of the rapier. In an open field, it would be pretty difficult to get past the rapier blade. And the rapier would shut down a lot of tactics and attacks. Now, if we're talking rapier or side sword with a dagger, so that each fighter is using both hands, this would do a lot to compensate for the weaknesses that the rapier has, because now suddenly you're not defends this up close. Now, of course, the samurai could also grab a wakizashi or tanto, but in doing so, you would give up a lot of the advantages. And of course, it would mean that both the samurai's hands are exposed to cuts and thrusts, while the musketeer's hands are almost entirely unavailable as targets. If, however, we're talking a self-defense situation on the street, say the two bump into each other in a dark alley, and the samurai doesn't take kindly to that, and immediately draws and cuts from the scabbard, the musketeer is kind of screwed. This is not a quick draw weapon. It's worn quite low to even be able to draw it, but it's not fast. So probably the best chance would be to try to block with the rapier drawn halfway, at which point you can't use it yet and you're very susceptible to grappling. So I don't think that would go well for the musketeer. If both met on the battlefield fully armored, that would be a completely different situation, and they probably wouldn't even be using those swords. The musketeer would definitely not be using a rapier with a narrow blade. It would be either a military rapier with a much stouter blade or a side sword. And for both, it would be a backup weapon anyway. They would be fighting primarily with polearms or simply, shoot each other with muskets. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. Big shout out to my patrons and YouTube members. You folks help out a lot. And there's going to be an ad-free extended edit of this video for you. Check out your feed. And thanks for watching. Take care.